This video was brought to you by CuriosityStream. Sign up now to get our streaming service Nebula absolutely free, where you can watch exclusive TLDR videos and an extended version of our show, The Daily Briefing. On Friday, as part of its Dobbs v. Jackson decision, the Supreme Court announced that it will be overturning Roe v. Wade. That's the landmark 1973 decision which ruled that the US Constitution guaranteed a woman a right to an abortion without excessive government interference. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at that decision, explaining the reasoning behind it, and asking which other historic cases might be next. Now, before we get into it, we should say that we actually did another video on this topic when the draft opinion on this decision was first leaked, and in that one, we fully explained the legal reasoning behind this decision. As such, today's video is more about the consequences of this decision, so make sure to watch both videos for a deeper understanding of what's happened and what it means for the future. Anyway, to start this video, let's briefly explain Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the two cases that were overturned on Friday. Let's start with Roe. Essentially, in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled that a Texas law banning abortions in most instances violated what's known as the right to privacy. The right to privacy isn't explicitly stated in the Constitution, but the court agreed that it could be inferred from the First, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and especially 14th Amendment, which prohibits states from abridging the privileges or immunities of citizens. And as such, they ruled that a ban on abortions violated this inferred right to privacy. This issue was raised once again in 1992 in Planned Parenthood v. Casey, where plaintiffs argued that an abortion law in Pennsylvania, which limited access to abortions, ultimately contradicted Roe v. Wade. Ultimately, the Supreme Court reaffirmed Roe with their ruling, with three conservative Republican appointees arguing that while they weren't entirely comfortable with the legal reasoning supporting this right to an abortion, their concerns were outweighed by a respect for precedent, something known in legal lingo as stare decisis, which means to stand by things decided. Basically, the idea here is that judges should, in general, try and uphold established legal precedents, both because it improves the perceived integrity of the law and discourages legal challenges going forward. If judges instead went around constantly overturning established precedents, the citizenry would lose faith in the law and there would be constant litigation. Obviously though, stare decisis isn't absolute, and the Supreme Court can and has overruled prior precedents. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the 1945 Brown v. Board of Education ruling, which found that racial segregation of children in schools was unconstitutional, thereby overruling the infamous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson ruling, which upheld the constitutionality of racial segregation under the separate but equal doctrine. So it's clear that while it might be unusual, the court can and does overturn previous precedent. And that's exactly what happened here. In their ruling, the court basically said two things. Firstly, they rejected the idea that there was a constitutional basis for the right to an abortion. And secondly, they said that stare decisis was outweighed in this instance by their concerns about the constitutionality of an abortion. In other words, they said that they don't agree with Roe, and furthermore, they don't really care about its precedent either. Now, the first thing isn't all that surprising. The constitutional reasoning behind the original ruling has long been subject to skepticism from various conservative judges. It's the second thing, though, the lack of respect for the precedent, that's both more surprising and more significant. It's surprising, one, because Roe had been settled law for about 50 years, so it's certainly a stronger precedent than most, and two, because basically all of the judges who concurred with the opinion at least implied during their hearings that they had respect for Roe and its precedent.
Do I have this day an opinion, a personal opinion, on the outcome in Roe versus Wade? And my answer to you is that I do not.
But do you think there is as fundamental a concern as legitimacy of the court would be involved if Roe were to be overturned?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think that the legitimacy of the court would be undermined in any case if the court made a decision based on its perception of public opinion.
So a good judge will consider it as precedent of the United States Supreme Court, worthy as treatment of precedent like any other.
Senator, I said that it's settled as a precedent of the Supreme Court entitled to respect under principles of stare decisis. And one of the important things to keep in mind about Roe v. Wade is that it has been reaffirmed many times over the past 45 years.
As Richard Fallon from Harvard said, Roe is not a super precedent because calls for its overruling have never ceased, but that doesn't mean that Roe should be overruled.
So, having seen those clips, it's maybe surprising that the justices changed their mind. But it's more than just surprising, it's also significant. Because if this court doesn't care as much about stare decisis as previous ones, as seems to be the case, then other landmark rulings are also at greater risk than they were previously. Justice Thomas actually made this explicit in his concurring opinion, where he recommended that the court revisited Griswold, Lawrence, and Obergefell, all of which are cases that rely on an expansive interpretation of the 14th Amendment. For those of you who don't know, the 1965 Griswold v. Connecticut ruling inferred a constitutional right to privacy, which included the right to contraception for all married citizens, which paved the way for Roe v. Wade 8 years later. The 2003 Lawrence v. Thomas ruling declared anti-sodomy laws, which criminalized consensual activity between two consenting adults, to be unconstitutional, while the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges ruling required all states to recognize same-sex marriages and issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples. And Justice Thomas highlighting all of these as potentially up for review is significant, because Thomas, who was appointed to the court in 1991, dissented on both Lawrence and Obergefell, arguing that in both cases the Constitution didn't provide any such right to privacy or liberty. At the time, Thomas was outvoted by the other justices on the court, but this court's decision on Roe and its apparent insensitivity for stare decisis suggests that all three cases are now up for grabs, which is significant to huge groups of the American populace. Beyond that, though, this court's apparent insensitivity for stare decisis is also important because it can undermine the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. As we mentioned earlier, if the court goes around overturning established precedents and therefore undermining previous iterations of the court, then the citizenry could lose faith in their decisions. Because, well, if the court doesn't agree with itself, then why should anyone else listen to it? Now, to be fair, this is something that the court is clearly aware of. And in the ruling, they explicitly note that stare decisis, quote, contributes to the actual and perceived integrity of the judicial process, but go on to argue that it's more important for an issue to be, quote, settled right than to be merely settled. That might be their justification, but this reversal will undermine public faith in the Supreme Court, which isn't good news in the context of wider collapse in trust for American institutions. In fact, polling done by Gallup before the decision, but after the draft opinion leaked, found that trust in the Supreme Court had already collapsed to an all-time low of just 25%. For context, this is down 11 points from just 2021, and about half the historic average of roughly 50%. Perhaps unsurprisingly, considering what's happened, trust among Democrats was at just 13%, while trust among Republicans was slightly higher at 39%. Again, it's worth keeping in mind that this polling was done before the Dobbs ruling, which might mean that trust amongst Democrats is even lower than it was before. Trust in the court will also be affected by the fact that concurring justices implied that they respected Roe as precedent during their hearings before apparently U-turning on this decision. And this is particularly worrying because, as we mentioned a second ago, this is happening in the context of a wider collapse in trust for American institutions. In 2021, Gallup polling found that Americans' trust in institutions had declined to a nearly all-time low, and it's actually expected to hit an all-time low later this year, when Gallup data for 2022 is released in early July. All in all, the court's recent ruling isn't just bad news for anyone who's pro-choice. It's also bad news for anyone who cares about the continuing collapse of trust in American institutions. But if you want to be updated on this story as it plays out, then you should subscribe to Daily Briefing, our show where we break down the 5 stories of each day that you need to know about in just 5 minutes. Now, you can watch the show on the Daily Briefing YouTube channel, or you can listen by searching for the podcast. But if you want the extended version of the show, that's an extra 10 minutes every single day and an ad-free experience, then you'll want to sign up to our streaming service, Nebula. There, you'll also find exclusive TLDR videos which never make it to YouTube, as well as all of our latest videos ad-free. Now, if you're interested in that, then I've got some good news, because we've partnered with CuriosityStream, home of the best documentaries online. And thanks to them, you can get both streaming services, CuriosityStream for the documentaries and Nebula for bonus TLDR, for less than $15 a year. That's a wild deal, and a 26% discount on their already low price. So get yourself a ton of documentaries and exclusive content from your favorite creators, including the Daily Briefing Extended Edition, by signing up using the link below. Thanks for your support.